Hello and welcome to Sneak Live. I'm your host, Brian Clark. Go by Clarkio on the interwebs. And I hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a great day wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And today we have some fun in store for you, as always, of course. And that is, well, I'm going to start with a question for you, actually. How many of you out there as developers write tests for your code? Be honest. Be honest with yourself and honest with us. If I'm being honest, my answer to that is sometimes. But regardless of whether that's the case or not, maybe today will help motivate you, inspire you to maybe do a little bit more of that because you're going to see the benefits of it firsthand. Thanks to the fine folks that are joining us from Codecov, we're going to introduce right now and bring on stage, and that is Tom who?
Hey, how's it going, Brian?
It's going well. How are you?
I'm doing great. No complaints. That was quite the intro. I was very amused by that. And, I totally get it when you say, oh, I don't always test my code because I feel like I've been in that boat so many times in my career.
100%. Yeah. Like, I mean, to this day, I still struggle with it. Like, I know how important it is, but I'm still like, you know, because like part of it is you're tasked with like you just got to deliver like some functionality, some code. You just got to get it done, right? And so I kind of take an iterative approach which makes it my life a little bit more difficult, right? And most developers, in that like you get it done, get it working, and then you go back and you're like, okay, let me retrofit some tests in here,
Oh
and
my
then you're
gosh.
like, oh, I didn't really write that so well to be as testable, so don't look over here, like right?
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. I feel like I work for a company like where we basically sorry, I work at Codecov. Hi, I'm Tom.
Hey, Tom.
But at Codecov, we do code coverage as a service, which basically means we help software developers figure out what code they tested and what code they haven't tested. And all that's to say is like we really focus on making sure that companies and orgs and teams and whatever have like a good testing culture. So what I was going to say is that yeah, I mean, like I was writing code the other day, and I was like messing around afterwards. Like, maybe I should write tests for it. And I was like, you know what? It's like 2 a.m. I'm kind of tired. I don't really want to write tests for it. Maybe I'll just like put it on a PR. And I felt really dirty the next morning. And some of my coworkers were like, you didn't write tests for this, did you? It's like, we are a testing company. You know that, right? It's like,
I was about to say, like, you kind of like you get in trouble. I mean, you're working at a testing company and then you don't have tests in your own code. Like, it's against the rules. Is that like a prerequisite to join?
Pretty much. I used to joke around that I was like, oh yeah, like I never write tests, like never at all. And then I joined Codecov and I was like, oh, this isn't going to fly. I'm going to have to write some tests here and there.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like I think sorry, I don't even know like where we're going to go with this, but I was just I was thinking back like before I jumped on, and I feel like most of the developers I've ever worked with, like at some point in their life or in their career, they hit that kind of point where they're like, oh, I should have written tests for this. And sometimes it's that like Friday afternoon and you're like, I don't want to be working on this, but I have to push this fix. And if I don't, I'm going to have a really rotten weekend. And I feel like that's kind of like the point where developers like, okay, I guess I should start writing tests now.
Yeah. And I hear you in that, in all that. And also I like how you're like, I don't know where we're going with this. That's the nature of a live stream, Tom. That's the beauty of it. Like wherever the conversation takes us is what's going to happen. And especially the viewers that are watching and checking this out and joining us live, which first of all, I see a familiar name that is Frackberg in chat. So thank you, Frackberg, for joining in on here and joining us. Frackberg also says, I do everything I can to avoid testing, basically.
Yeah, I know. I saw that. And I was kind of like, yeah, I mean, I get where you're coming from. Like, there's definitely those times when, again, it's late at night. You don't want to do any testing. But man, it's bitten me in the butt way more often than I would like. And so
Yes.
I don't know. I'd be kind of curious to see like what do you do to avoid it?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Familiar. I've never seen you before in my life, Clark. Okay. All right, Frackberg. Enough of the joking around. All right. So let's get into more of what we're going to be talking about today. But before we jump too deep into that, I want folks to get to know you and learn a little bit more about you, Tom. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your background, and then we'll jump into more of this testing
Uh,
topic.
yeah,
Yeah.
sure. So yeah, like I mentioned, I'm Tom. I work at Codecov. I'm the lead, well, I don't even know what I'm called anymore. Developer relations lead. What that basically means is that I interface with our users, with developers, trying to figure out what we can do to make their life better, how to figure out why they're avoiding tests, and what we can do to show them that testing is really good best practice. Before this, I was a software developer for about 8 or 9 years. I worked at a bunch of startups, one or two larger companies, and I loved that life. I loved coding, making things, shipping something out and seeing users use it. But I also really like the part of my life where I get to like talk to people. And so I moved over to developer relations about 4 or 5 years ago, and really, really loved it ever since.
Nice. That's awesome to hear. And I like how you tied in what Frackberg said there of like trying to help people not avoid testing. Well played. Well played.
No, I mean, like I mentioned, I totally get it, and I see that they mentioned like, oh, like not learning anti suites, and now I have to pick up Jest over the last few months. Yeah, just is kind of fun. Yeah, it has its quirks, and I think like especially JavaScript, um, dealing with the nature of JavaScript, as they say,
Yes.
can be painful at parts, but yeah,
Yeah. All right. So thanks for sharing a little bit about you, and that's awesome to hear of the background that you had. And welcome to DevRel. I'm glad to hear
it's
that.
great to be here. I didn't even know this was a thing like 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like we could do a whole thing on like, how did you find Deverell?
100%. Yes. There's a lot of that going on. But maybe we'll hold that off for another time, right?
Sounds good.
So, as the title shows on our stream and video today, is like de-risking our code, right?
Yeah.
Why why do you feel people need to like maybe some people just like to live on the edge, like on the wild side, right? Why
You
why
know,
should folks be caring about de-risking their code, Tom?
I mean, there are definitely instances, like why you might not want to care. And, those instances are sometimes like college, when you're writing some college code. I'm sure if you've ever had to do that, tests are your least concerning thing. But I feel like, once you start adding more than one user or one collaborator on a code base, once you can't fit all of the code in your head and someone else has to now think about that code, that's kind of where things get risky, right? Like if I'm on a team and the lead developer has left for whatever reason, or is on vacation, like it doesn't have to be like a permanent thing, and you're like, oh, great, like I'm going to write this feature and it touches a lot of their code, and you don't understand their code, um, you're bound to make mistakes, right? You're bound to need to ask questions or need to do something. And, where we live in this sort of world where the time is very expensive. And so if you can like go to a test suite and say, hey, like this is how this class or this object works, you're going to be in a much better position. You're going to, not waste time later down the road. If I'm pushing some code today and it has a bug in it, let's say it has a bug and I don't know about it, and a month later it comes back to bite me, it's going to be really painful. I'm not going to understand the code anymore. Like I'm might be on a different project and I just don't have context on it anymore. And so I just feel like if you can write a test that will be beneficial to you or to whoever's looking at the code in the future, like you're just setting yourself up for success. And how that sort of ties into de-risking like your code base. Like there's that aspect, and then testing ideally is supposed to help you find bugs, right? It's not going to find everything. Like we all know that's true. You can write as many tests as you want. You're probably going to miss something because users will use your product in ways you don't expect. But it'll at least get you there. Like it'll at least get you partway there, and that is far better than experiencing a ton of pain later on.
Yeah. I definitely feel you, and I think essentially what I'm hearing from you is it saves you time in the long run, right? Which is
No,
important to us all as developers. And I guess the one thought, and kind of putting you on the spot here, that
that's fine.
tends to come in maybe developers' minds is it feels like right. It's this constant like battle that's torn depending on the culture at a company or on a team. When you're developing something, it's like you got to ship features but then you also got to make sure you do these tests. So if it's not part of the culture that the time it takes to implement tests and getting everything set up for that feature set that you might be adding, if that's not included in the estimation and however whatever process they're using, right, to track
Sure.
the work, right? If that's not included in there and it's just expected, like what the odds are that's not gonna I mean, what's been your experience with that, right? Like how do you account for that situation when it comes to testing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, as you were describing that like really hit home. I've definitely worked at companies where the idea is like, we are going to ship as quickly as possible, like by whatever means. And you find yourself 2, 3 months down the road, like working on the same project, because guess what? It had a bunch of bugs, and now you're fixing bugs, and not only your bugs, but like the previous person who worked on its bugs.
Hmm.
And this like cycle just kind of continues. And if you aren't like a brilliant engineer who can do it all at once very very quickly, you're going to find yourself in a hole. And like nobody wants to sort of be unsuccessful, right? And you're asking like, well, how do you sort of deal with this? How do you sort of deal with, you're at this company, you're at this organization, they don't have a testing culture. um, we wrote a blog post about this.
Oh, yeah?
But the steps are pretty simple, like from at least my perspective. And I think like if you're a developer and some like vice president is like, hey, we're going to do code coverage and we're going to aim for like 80%, like that's miserable. Like developers aren't going to like that. They're going to rage about it. I would definitely rage about it. And do everything possible not to do it right. But still try to get to that 80%. And so I think kind of like the best sort of first step is, one, have buy-in from the developers, right? Like if you've gotten to the point where like, yeah, we are in this pain point, like we are still working on the same features, we're not moving forward as quickly as we can, then like just add code coverage and look at it. You don't have
Mm.
to do anything with it. You don't have to improve it. Just know it exists, and like know that, yeah, it could be painfully bad. It could be painfully good too. But know that like this is something. And then I think from there, it's about, hey, we understand that like you didn't write all the code. We understand that it's really painful to go and ask you to write tests for code you don't know, code you don't understand. So how about as a next step, why don't you just like make sure you test 50% of just your code, right? Like you're making a pull request and you add, I don't know, like 100 lines of code. Like just make sure 50 of those lines have coverage. Or whatever metric is reasonable to in your org. And like just start there, because I think like if you set this broad goal of like we're going to be 100% code coverage, you're setting yourself up for failure. Your developers aren't going to be happy. Like you're not going to be happy. Your execs aren't going to be happy at the end, and people at the end are like, code coverage is useless. Right? Because like I hear that all the time. Like people are like, oh, it's a vanity metric, and it's like, well, kind of, but not really. And so I think like taking those like small steps, and like once you get this culture of like, okay, like we're testing our code, we're at a pretty good place, then start thinking about increasing that number. Start being like, okay, like we're at 30%, maybe we hit like 40% end of quarter, or 50% by the end of the year, whatever you want it to be. But at least being able to take small steps, like anything you do in life, is kind of like um, the suggestion.
No, yeah, definitely. That's great. I like that a lot. And I think it really helps kinda, uh, attack straight on that mentality of that like, I've reflecting on that what you just said, that I've even experienced where when I'm thinking, "Okay, I need to get my code tested, I need to make sure I cover as much as I possibly can," my immediate thought goes, "I gotta cover everything. I gotta get 100%." And that's the only and then, like, but then that becomes this, like, daunting, overwhelming task because then it's like, I gotta spend so much time trying to get to 100%, and I don't spend as much time delivering features and updates that need to happen that are also on my backlog, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So I love that you put it that start small, set certain low level metrics to try and strive for, and then go from there kind of thing. So that's great. You mentioned one, you mentioned your blog, which I shared the link to the
yeah.
general blog there, but you sounded like you had a specific one that also discusses in depth what you just shared.
Yeah, I'll, I don't have it offhand. I can probably take a look
Sure.
and search it out.
No
It might
problem.
actually just be in the final stages before we push live, but I
Okay,
just
okay.
wrote it, so
Fair enough, fair enough. Yeah,
I
yeah, I feel you.
lied a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, yeah, but, when that goes out, happy to share as well.
Cool. So I also like to make sure we take on a perspective from like a beginner, right? That maybe hasn't heard this term code coverage, right? Which you
Yeah,
mentioned.
yeah.
We've mentioned several times so far. What is code coverage and like what does it do? What's the purpose of it? Let's
Yeah.
dive into that.
I do love describing code coverage because I feel like, it really depends. Like we can take this from sort of any level, right? Like if you are a developer, like you've tested or you've coded before, or like you're just starting to learn to code, then code coverage is just a concept that, hey, like you write lines of code, presumably you're going to test some of that code, um, and so it's just a metric that says, hey, out of how many lines in your code base, this is how many you've tested. So let's say I have a really simple like hello world app in Java, and it's probably 10 lines because it's Java. Um, and of those, I've tested 5 of them. So your code coverage would be 50%, right? Or because it's a hello world project, it's probably pretty simple. Then you might have written one test that says yes, like I'm outputting hello world, and that would actually run through all 10 lines of code. But if we want to go even like simpler than that, like let's say you've never coded before and you just happen across this live stream, you're like, oh, this sounds interesting because you're risking code changes. Then you can think about it like a recipe book, where you have different recipes, where recipes are kind of like your code, quote unquote. And your coverage would be someone goes out, makes the recipe, tastes it, and makes sure it tastes fine. And
Mm.
so, like, let's say I have like 10 recipes in this book. Um, let's say it's like dumplings, because we're on the theme of Asian food. But let's say it's like 10 dumpling recipes, and I've only cooked, I'm a tester, and I've only cooked 3 of them. And I've eaten them like, great, like these ones taste fine. Then I've hit 30% coverage because 3 of the total 10. And that's basically what co-coverage is.
Nice. Yeah. I like how you went with the food metaphor as well.
We
Definitely
were talking
appreciate that.
earlier about food, and I feel like I'm not a foodie by any stretch of the imagination, but I do really enjoy food, and appreciate delicious food.
Yes, and I appreciate your metaphors you used around that too. It's awesome. I see we have a question in the chat if you're prepared to potentially we both can be
Yeah,
prepared to
of
answer it.
course.
So who in the engineering org, this is from Ilias, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, let me know. Who in the engineering org should own code coverage in writing the tests, the soft developers or QA engineering team?
Yeah, actually, Ilias is a buddy of mine.
Oh,
I told him about this live stream,
nice.
so
Well,
thank you so
welcome.
much, man. Um, but he's a PM at a startup, and I don't know about like what his org is currently like, or the struggles that they're going through. But in thinking about like who should actually own code coverage and write the tests, traditionally code coverage is based around unit testing, and so unit testing. Um, Going back to the food analogy, if you're not familiar with unit tests, um, let's say I have a really complex recipe and it includes like 3 sauces, and I have to do things with meat, and I have to make pasta, and a bunch of different steps. So unit tests would say, hey, let's just test out the sauce. Is the I don't know my friend's sauces. Is this red sauce going to be delicious? And so you would test that one part out, or one unit. And then you would have another unit test saying like, okay, great, like the pasta, like did it come out in as rigatoni, or did it come out as penne, or whatever it happens to be. So that's basically what a unit test is. So going back, code coverage has traditionally been around unit tests. It doesn't always have to be, and that's actually something we can talk about later. It's very exciting. But because unit tests are also traditionally written by developers, I think code coverage is definitely owned by software developers.
Okay.
Now, in terms of writing tests, there are other kinds of tests. So you could have end-to-end tests, integration tests. Okay, so integration test is like, okay, I want to add 2 of the sauces to the pasta and make sure the pasta, still has like good flavor. So that would be an integration test when you're adding like different components, seeing if they work well together, if they're like jiving. And an end-to-end test is like, great, like I've made this entire recipe, and yes, I have a delicious meat 3 sauce pasta at the very end.
Mm,
And so I think, as depending on the size of the organization, you start to see that branch off. And you start to see QA getting involved. You start to see product getting involved in not only writing a test plan, but the actual tests themselves. And so you do start to see QA owning a little bit of code coverage. But I think for the vast majority of use cases, you will see developers owning that.
Gotcha. That makes sense to me. And I think I've had similar experience with that as well, where in past organizations, um, that's been the case a lot, where the engineers are owning writing unit tests and the code coverage of that. But then as you start getting to more behavioral type testing, I think it's kind of
Yeah, yeah,
described
yeah.
as, right? More longer term, more things, more pieces of the system are interacting with it than just like your bit of code that adds this function, right?
Yeah.
Um, that's when you start having like a QA engineering team, and that's yeah. And the other thing I wanted to mention that you got me thinking now with all these the food metaphors or analogies is next time I'm cooking with family, I'm gonna use that as an opportunity to be like, "So, this is a lot like unit test, and my buddy Tom who was telling me about," and, they're gonna roll their eyes and be like, "Shut up, Brian."
Like, we just want food. Just get it on the table and feed us.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you, Ilias, for the question again. So moving on from this, so we were talking about how tests and code coverage de-risk our code. How exactly does code coverage really provide that value of de-risking the code, making sure that it's you know not as
Sure.
risky, right?
So, when I talk about this, I usually talk about the antithesis. So, well, what happens when you don't have code coverage, or let's say you're not doing a lot of testing? And so, I feel like when you're in that sort of case and you don't have a lot of tests, you just don't know what's happening with your code base. Like you don't, you like again, you might be in that case where the one developer is like, I have it all in my head. Like this is great. I can
Mhm.
handle it. But when you start to get larger, you lose that ability to share that knowledge transfer. And so like when you don't have any tests, you're putting yourself in a position to fail. But I think like so the question initially was just like, great code coverage. How do you? Sorry, rephrase that for me again. I lost my train of thought.
How is code coverage helping us de-risk our code? I guess is
Oh,
the
okay, okay. So when you're able to point out and say, hey, like we've at least tested all of our code, we know that it runs, we know that some general use case is going to be successful, then you're not going to be in a position where you're like pushing something out to production and saying, oh, like no one has ever run this before. And so let's say you're in that sort of state where you're like, great, like we've pushed out to production, our code coverage is high, we feel really good, awesome. But then, like, let's take a look a few commits later. And I'm a developer and I come in and I say, okay, great. Like, I'm adding this new feature. But what I don't know is that this new feature touches an API endpoint that is, that doesn't exist anymore for whatever reason. Right. And at least I know that if there were tests written for that, that this new feature, if it's going to break it, will come up in those tests.
Hmm.
Right. So I think like, a lot of what we think about in terms of code is snapshots. We think about great, like what commit did this happen at, or like where are we with our code base right now? But what we don't always talk about is that code is always changing, right? Like it's not supposed to be static. Ideally, if your product is growing, it's not supposed to be static. It's going to be dynamic, and if you don't know how your change is going to affect the rest of the system, you again, like I don't know, I feel like I've said this a lot this live stream so far, but like you're putting yourself in a world of pain.
No,
And
no worries
so
about saying that. Yeah, you got to emphasize the message, right?
world of pain, right tests, code coverage, the three most important things from this. um, right. And so yes, like getting a good code coverage number at some point in time is great. But the real benefits happen when you continuously change your code.
Yeah,
Because then you can trust that at least things are tested. At least, like, if I'm writing code, it will break, and I'll know that it breaks before I deploy or before I merge into main.
yeah. And going back to what I was saying before, while I don't usually or very often as I should, write tests, the times that I have, it's just giving me that like a different level of confidence that when I add things, change things, introduce something new into it, that I'll know ahead of time whether or not it's gonna, you know, result in a negative behavior or more positive behavior, kind of a result in
Yeah.
those changes, you know?
And, like,
Um,
to be clear, I think, there are definitely cases where, like, sure, you don't really need to test or code coverage isn't that useful.
what
And, like, some of
really
those
quick, what would be those cases then?
yeah, I was gonna say,
Yeah.
like, for example, it's like, if you are at a company where, like, you're literally starting out from scratch and, like, you have no product and you just need to move fast and iterate and see, like, are we even on the right track? Then sure, like, testing's gonna take up a lot of your time, and I get that that's not where you are right now, and it's totally valid to be like, "We're not gonna deal with code coverage."
Yep.
And other ones, like, again, if you're, like, the only person working on a particular project and you don't expect anyone to ever work on it also, you probably don't need code coverage. You can, if the product is complicated enough, but if this is just like a hobby project, you're not really interested. You're the only consumer of the code. That's fine. You don't really need it. But I think once you start to get to a point where it is costly to run into bugs in production, that's when code coverage is important, or that's when you should consider, hey, like at least let's write tests, and if we're going to write tests, let's at least know where we're testing. Um, the other thing I was going to bring up is that not every piece of your code is also going to be important,
Hmm.
right? Like if we go back to that instance where it's like, oh, your product is brand new and you're just trying to move fast. I mean, that happens at companies all the time, right? Like you're building out a new feature from absolutely nothing, and you just want to see like, are we going to get users? Are we going to get any traction?
Right.
That's like okay, like that's fine. Like you don't really have to worry about it unless it's so well connected to your existing product. If it's like something off, like it's a brand new product offering, it's like okay, like that's fine. Figure it out, iterate. Worry about whether or not this is what you should be doing, prioritizing. But once you know that this is something that is important, that's when code coverage can be useful.
Gotcha. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. The other thought that came to my mind when you were describing that too was and tying it back to security a little bit. There have been times that I use Snyk to help me identify vulnerabilities in like my open source dependencies in my
Yeah,
own side project, right?
sure.
And some of them, I'm a little hesitant to, merge the changes to upgrade to a new version of those dependencies because I don't know what the impact might be.
Yeah,
And if I had more tests around that and had some code coverage to, like, give me at least a better level of confidence in knowing whether merging in those changes are gonna have what type of effect that might have, right, on my
sure.
project. So, yeah. I
Yeah,
think they go hand in hand, security and tests, in
yeah,
general, right?
absolutely. Right. Like the live stream is called Derisking code changes, because that's what we do, right? Like I think as a developer, when you're thinking about de-risking code change, you fall into these buckets of like, I want to make sure my code is in a good place, right? I want to make sure that I'm not affecting anyone else's code. And third is that like I want to make sure that I'm not introducing any security vulnerabilities,
Right.
right? And so I think like with the companies that we're at and the products that we build, those are important things to us. Like we do care that you're in this place where, yeah, you might not ever be 100% confident because unless you delete a bunch of code, then that code isn't going to come bite you. But at least can you get a little bit better? Can you get to that point where, great, like I think that this is going to be good and the cost isn't going to be too high if it's wrong.
Yeah. And I love that feeling of deleting some code though,
Oh, it's so
don't you?
good. It's so good.
It's so good.
Isn't there like a quote where it's like, I'm going to terribly misquote this. That's like, junior developers, like they feel really good when they add like, 200 lines of code on a new feature. And they're like, yes, I did it. And like the senior developer like feels really good when they delete 200 lines of code because they're like,
Yep.
oh, yes, I did it.
Yeah, yeah. I think I know which one you're referring to.
Yeah.
You hit it spot on for me at least, you know? All right, cool. So we learned about code coverage and testing. We learned why it's helpful, what value it brings. How does CodeCov come into play? What does CodeCov offer to us
Yeah.
as developers to, you know, cover this topic for us and help us de-risk our code?
Sure. Yeah, I guess like the whole point is like, what is CodeCov and
Yeah.
how do we fit into all of this? So most languages already have their own code coverage tools. So like if we talked earlier about Jest. You Jest is a framework for unit testing, mostly on JavaScript. I think TypeScript as well. Yeah, probably TypeScript as well.
Mhm.
And with Jest, you can also collect code coverage reports. And so these code coverage reports can be, I think, just as like JSON or XML as well, or maybe an HTML file. And it basically like can show you like, hey, like for this particular state of your code base, these lines of code have tests. These lines of code have never been tested. And what I mean by that is that when you run your test suite, when you're on CI or locally, it basically tracks like, oh, this line was run or this line was not run. Is kind of the general gist of it. So that's great. Like most languages do that already. Codecov doesn't do that. However,
really quick, Tom, when you say CI for folks that maybe aren't as familiar with that, what do you mean by that?
So I was thinking about another food analogy. I don't know if I can
Go
come up
for it.
one
Come on.
so quickly.
Oh, no.
I was thinking like, okay, like a restaurant and you have back of the house and front of the house, but I think I'm going to fail there. So CI stands for continuous integration. It's typically called CI/CD, which is continuous integration, continuous deployment. And the whole idea behind CI/CD is that instead of making, okay, think back to like Windows days. If you're an old dinosaur like me, you would like have to buy like the Windows 95 CD and install that on your computer. We didn't have laptops then. Yeah.
All right,
Install it on
what's
your
a
computer.
CD? No, I'm just kidding.
How deep in this rabbit hole can we go?
Yeah.
What's a computer? So you would have to do that, and you can't just ship a bunch of new CDs all the time. You know, if you're like, oh, like we'll make this bug fix and we'll ship a new CD to everyone who has ever installed this. That's just not feasible. So that was kind of like the more what was called waterfall architecture. And CI/CD came around and said, hey, like we're at this place where we can say, you know what, we want to make this change and ship this change to everyone all at once. And that's because of the internet and the cloud and whatnot. And so CI/CD will basically take a list of kind of steps to do before it releases it to everyone. And those steps might be test your code, make sure it runs in like all these different environments. If you're using Python, back when Python 2 was a thing, does it run on all the versions of Python 2? Does it run on all the new versions of Python 3? And basically you can set it up just to make sure to automate all of these steps so that you don't have to do it manually and you don't have to worry about, oh, it works on my machine. I don't know why it doesn't work on your machine. Where were we?
We were so sorry. We went on that. Again, trying to keep it beginner friendly. So that's why I'm like, all right, when we use acronyms or something like that, I try to catch myself in that and call it out. And this way we can. But I appreciate that explanation. You're talking about how CodeCov comes into play.
Yeah. How it fits into this whole system. Okay.
Yeah.
So most languages, like I said, already have this code coverage tool somehow, some way. That's kind of the beginning process of CodeCov. So we take those as our input and we output coverage metrics across your entire code base. So one of the kind of main use cases for this is like, well, what happens if I have a front end and back end? You know, my back end might be in Go or might be in Python or Ruby or whatever the case. And I also have front end code, you know, that's running React, Angular, Vue. And those languages have their coverage tools, but they produce different reports. Yeah. So I might understand how something's working in one part of my code base, but I don't understand it in the other. So CodeCov automatically merges all that information together and presents it as one single thing.
Nice. Okay.
So that's kind of like the base use case of CodeCov and the one that like is sort of expected to work. On top of that, we do provide other things inside of pull request. If you don't use GitHub, by the way, like I think it's a merge request in GitLab. I'm mostly using GitHub terminology. But if you're making a code change at all, we provide 2 other features that are useful for developers. And the reason I bring this up is because, yeah, I mean, this is becoming CodeCov is a product that does awesome things. But the reason I think it's important is that we try to provide information that is useful for the developer before they're going to merge in their code. And so the first bit is we add a comment. And the comment just shows, hey, like these are all the files that are changing. These are the ones that have good coverage. These are the ones that don't. And that's useful for both developer and for reviewer. Because as a reviewer, I want to come in and, you know, like I'm going to be annoyed as a reviewer if I come in as like, you didn't write any tests for anything, right? But now at least I can say, hey, I mean, CodeCov said you didn't write tests, so you have to write tests. And that's like a really quick, easy check that I can do as a reviewer and like, great, moving on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Um, and the other thing we provide are status checks. So, we mentioned a lot earlier where some companies are like 80% or like 100% code coverage or nothing. And that's fine if you're in that sort of position. We also provide ways to say, hey, like this pull request is going to lower code coverage. Or hey, like this particular PR is none of the code that you wrote was tested versus like the rest of the code base. So, I mean, those are kind of like the basic features that we have at CodeCo that are useful for developers.
Nice. That sounds really interesting to me. Especially the pull request or merge request. Anytime you're introducing changes into the existing code base, having that that feature. And what I've been seeing more and more, I think, it just in general, like the point you were making, instead of somebody else having to talk to the person that opened up the pull request and say, "Hey, you didn't." It's like a difficult discussion
Yeah.
sometimes, depending on people's personality, right? Because especially when it's happened virtually over the internet, context and tone can be lost,
Yeah.
and so, it could become a little bit of a heated situation potentially, right?
Sure.
Right? But I'm seeing more and more, especially in the open source world where they're using, like, bots to kinda help, uh, because it's a little bit easier to digest as somebody that's receiving that feedback from a bot versus a person, you know what I mean? Like, and
Yeah.
and then for the person that's maintaining it, it's easier for a bot to just do that so that they don't have to get sucked into a difficult conversation necessarily over something that is just a standard that they wanna have in the
Yeah.
project, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's awesome to hear.
I mean, I was gonna say like, yeah, I definitely know how prevalent bots are in pull requests now. They're very, very prevalent.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
true.
it's like we both know this because our companies do it. But I think that I mean it's for the benefit of developers, for the benefit of the reviewer, right? Like, are you going to be able to make this change, make it work before I'm going to not waste, but before I'm going to put a bunch of my effort into reviewing this code that hasn't even been run.
Yeah. We got an interesting question in the chat from Lognor that I wanna do.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
first they asked, "Aren't unit tests dead?" But the follow-up, I think, is, a fair point, right? When 80% of the code base is third-party libraries nowadays, how relevant is getting 90% test coverage? So I guess to me, diving into unpacking this a little bit more, what are your thoughts about testing around, open source dependencies, third-party dependencies?
yeah. So I think I realized that dependencies are kind of like a lot of the bulk of our code bases nowadays, right? Like if you're adding Angular or something, it's like a massive file, not massive file, but massive dependency. Um, I I realized that not every dependency that we're going to use in any of our projects are going to be like super well tested.
Mm,
My hope and my dream is that yes, like dependencies care about code coverage. They're going to be like 100% code coverage and like let's go.
yeah,
But I understand the reality that that's not going to happen. And so I think like yes, like you cannot control for those sort of things. If you're a great open source developer, like you might want to add some tests onto a dependency you really like. Um, and so I think to answer the question of like, well, like how relevant is 90% test coverage? I think 90% test coverage is important for your code, right? Like if you're including the rest of party libraries, then like, yeah, it's going to be inflated or deflated, I guess, depending on, how, what you're actually using. Um, but I think like you should worry about what you can possibly control. And if you want to be a really, helpful open source developer, like go add that, like go figure out like good tests. Because, if I'm a maintainer of an open source library and someone comes in and is like, hey, I wrote these really good tests for you, I'm going to be thrilled, right? Like I'm definitely not going to be like, no, I do not want your PR. Like,
right.
please take it back.
Yeah.
I'm going to be like, yeah, this is great. Like, thank you so much for doing this. And I think that only makes the entire open source ecosystem better. So, again, yes, third-party libraries wish they were better tested. Some are, some aren't, and that's fine. But at least worry about the test coverage that you have written, because that is what you can control for.
Excellent, yeah. And thank you for the question, Log. I also see, Tom, that, you're getting some love in
Yeah, I
chat
saw
from
that
It's
too.
Karma.
Yay! Thank
That's
you.
awesome here. All right, so how about what do you say? I think we've jibber jabbered quite a bit about all this stuff. What do you say we get into maybe a demo of Codecov? And
Ooh, didn't prepare a demo, but I can try really fast.
oh yeah, okay. I put you on the spot there. I'm sorry.
Yeah, let me see what I can do. This will be fun.
It's live. It's
It's
okay. You
live.
know,
It's
Peop
fine.
folks expect
Let me
expect things.
share like what codecov is supposed to ideally look like first, and then
Okay.
we can see if maybe like a true demo is possible. Let's see how good my coding skills are off the cuff.
All right, sounds good. And then
Uh,
while you're doing that, I see Log said, right, I agree with your point on writing tests for non-resource dependent codes. And they said thanks. So very
hey,
helpful. There's also see
um,
Karma there showing some love and first time chatter over on Twitch. Appreciate you being here.
hey, so fancy. Okay, hold up. I gotta make sure I'm in a good environment.
No worries, no worries. Folks, while
uh,
Tom's getting that set up, if you have any further questions or comments and things like that, feel free to drop them in the chat. They are welcome. We'll do our best to answer them if we can.
open up.
I guess while
Here.
also by a show of let's say hand emojis or just say, me in chat, how many of you write unit tests regularly in your projects? Let's see it. See how many folks we can find out. And be honest, like I said at the beginning, you got to be honest with
All right,
yourself and with
share
us.
my whole screen. We'll see what happens.
Okay.
Can you guys actually see it?
Not I see it behind the scenes, but if you
Oh,
switch
I see.
to yeah, there we go. I got you.
Okay. So I'm going to go to one of our example repositories because this is probably going to be the easiest place. Oh yeah,
Sure,
okay,
yeah.
cool. And we're in a good place. All right. So just to give context, like I mentioned, like one of the most useful places for codecov is in the pull request. So I have this example repository, and it's pretty simple. So like let's like walk through the file system just so everyone's kind of aware like what's happening. So this is in Python. I think it should be relatively approachable if you're not familiar with Python, because I feel like it's good enough from a pseudocode perspective. Well, in case anything's not clear, like just say the word. So the first directory that's important to us is this one called app, and an app is going to be all of the actual code. And so this is just some Python stuff, and the real code is in calculator.py. This is, as you would expect, a calculator app. And it does some pretty simple things: add, subtract, multiply, divide. I kind of want to point out these two lines here. If y is 0, because you can't divide by 0. And this is important because we'll see later on with test coverage what happens when you don't cover one part of a branch.
Really quick, Tom, could you zoom in just a little bit more, maybe 2 times more?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Perfect.
Better?
Thank you. Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so that's all said and done. Let's go back, and I already wrote some tests 3 months ago for this particular calculator. And they're pretty simple. We have 4 kind of major functions: 1 testing the addition, 1 subtract, 1 multiply, 1 divide. And again, I mentioned that we have this divide by 0 case. Right now it's commented out, and probably I'll make a PR that uncomments this out, and so we can kind of all see that and what sort of happens with code coverage there. So first, I'm going to go to Codecov, the actual UI, to sort of show what Codecov sort of looks like in the real world. Okay, let me see if I can do this offhand. App.codecov.io / Codecov example. So this is what the Codecov UI looks
Whoa,
like.
97.22%?
Yeah, but there's only 36 lines. And
True.
I think I've hinted at this earlier about which line isn't the one that's covered.
Yeah.
And it's the one that's around divide by 0. And we can kind of see that for ourselves, right? So I'm going to go to calculator.py, and I'm going to see, oh, look at that. We aren't testing the case where we divide by 0. And so it's like very blatantly obvious to us here. And right now that, yep, we haven't actually divided by 0. So this is great, and you can kind of look throughout the UI and kind of like play with it, and look at commits and the different pull requests. But what I want to show is what happens. Let's say I do add a unit test for that divide by 0 case. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and so I have a clean environment, and show you what that might look like.
Sounds good. By the way, it's Karma shared with us that they have one project that is 98% covered, and then one project that's 10% covered.
Well, if you average that, depending on the number of lines, you're doing great.
Yeah.
All right. So, sorry. Or in that case, I was like, oh.
No, don't worry about it. This is live. It's fine. It's not supposed to be like bang, 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 everything, something going on all the time.
All right. I'll do my entire screen again. Okay. So I mentioned that this was github.com/codecov/example. Great. So this is a repository. I am going to clone it. Clone, blah, blah, blah. cd example Python. Because I RMR'd it earlier. Config, so that's actually me. And let's do some coding. So let's check out add tests. Terrible branch name, but we're going to go with it. Can you guys see my screen, or should I make it a little bit?
A little bit bigger, yeah. I made it full screen so people can see folks, but that helps there. Yeah.
Oh, I've never live coded before. This is going to be fun.
Yes. I'm glad I'm here with you for that. I love live coding.
Well, this isn't too bad, right? Because really all I'm going to do is remove this assert that I already made. So am I cheating? Absolutely, I'm cheating. But whatever, it's going to be fine. Okay, so what I did is, this was commented before, and I removed the comment. And basically, this adds this use case. Or I'm taking 2 and dividing it by 0, and I want it to hit this line here. I want it to say cannot divide by 0. And so we're making this assertion on line 31 here of, yes, am I actually getting back this string or not? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save it. And we're going to, sorry, I got weird when I increased the screen. Git add, and let's commit it. Add divide by 0 use case.
You're wicked fast, man. I like it.
Okay, so I just pushed this commit and this branch up to GitHub, and I have it somewhere. I don't remember. Where are we? We're here. Okay, so I'm gonna refresh the page. Oh, that's weird. It didn't come up.
Uh-oh.
Did I not commit properly? Nope, those are my own messages. Oh, I turn this here now.
I'll hide screen for now until you're ready.
Yeah, no, that's okay. You know what? I probably have another branch called add tests. So we're going to do the thing where I call it add tests 2.
Oh, 2. Okay. I always, because I assume, I'm 0-based arrays, right? So the first one is always 0.
Oh, you're right. That's dirty. All right, we're going to go back to because we can. Why not? It's live. And I'm going to push again. Now, just to be clear, I have that one commit that's at divide by 0 by use case. And I'm going to push this up. And hopefully, I was not smart and 0-based. Oh, weird. Why isn't this pushing up? Oh, you know why? Because I'm incognito and I did not sign in. Okay. All right, hold on. Let me sign in real fast.
Well, Karma's pointing out a good thing. You're pushing, but you didn't open a PR yet.
Yeah. Also, what I'm used to in the GitHub UI is that there'll be this little banner that says you pushed up a new branch.
Right. Yeah.
And so that wasn't there. So where is everything? Okay. Come on. I know you like me more than this. Okay, cool. Okay, we're in a good spot. Let's do this.
Really quick, Tom. I noticed you must have hit a keyboard shortcut or something to turn off your camera.
Oh, my bad.
There
Can you see me now?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
I see it. I'll add it once you go away from StreamYard there. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Perfect. Here we go.
Let's do it. Okay.
Yes. Oh, but now we got both.
Yeah, so we had both. So it actually did work. I just wasn't signed in because I was in an incognito window. But now I'm not. So let's go with the OG. Let's do add tests. So as I mentioned, we made this branch add tests. We pushed a commit up, and let's take a look at what a pull request will look like. So as I mentioned, all we did was on comment this test, and because CI is probably already running, and actually I already know it's finished because of this green check mark. And so I want to talk about what I expect to see before we actually take a look.
Okay.
So what I expect to see is that Codecov will say, hey, you have 100% coverage. You have 100% coverage because that one line we looked at earlier is now being covered. And I know that because we all commented it here. I kind of mentioned this earlier with like what Codecov actually does. We'll see that comment. We'll also see 2 status checks. They should both pass. And what each of them are, the first one is the project status check. And that's basically taking a look at the entire code base. And it's saying, hey, what is your code coverage for the entire code base at the end of this particular commit? And just to kind of go back to what we were talking about, why that's really useful is that you can just track and say, hey, like when I'm making this code change, the entire code base's code coverage increases or the whole coverage decreases. And so if you are starting out with code coverage, one of the possible steps that you can take to build up this testing culture is to say, you know what, like we get it, we don't have great total code coverage, but let's just make sure that each pull request pushes it up a little bit more every time. So maybe we're at like 2% code coverage, and like again, that's fine. Let's just make sure that when the next person commits, that it doesn't go to 1.9. Let's just make sure it goes to like 2.01. And so that is one of the ways to increase code coverage over time. So that's the project status check, and so I expect it to pass. The other one, excuse me, hiccups, is the patch status check. And what that tells me is for all of the code that I have changed, I want to make sure that that code is tested. Now, this is for this particular case, it's like not super useful. And it's not super useful because I literally added a test. So if this isn't running, then like that's not great. That means my tests aren't running. I have another big problem on hand. But if you are in a case where you're adding a new feature and you want to make sure, hey, like, am I actually testing this feature at all? That would be a use case where the patch status check tells you information. So I'm going to open this pull request. And again, we'll get the comment from Codecov. I think that might take a little bit of time for the notification cycle to go through, but we should see both status checks. So let's see what happens. Clicked create.
Ooh,
and
okay, fairly fast, man. Wow.
Well, it's really fast because it already happened, right?
Mm.
So the way that CI/CD for GitHub Actions work is that you have two. Sorry, now we're tangenting. You have two, or in this case, you have two events. You have the push and you have the pull request. So push happens whenever a commit is literally pushed up to GitHub. And so when we're in my Vim terminal and you saw me do GP, which means git push, or shorthand for it, once GitHub is aware of this commit, it will run CI. You saw before, though, that this one, pull request, it was in this sort of like a yellow circle state because it hadn't run yet because the pull request hadn't been opened.
Yeah.
And so it was running once I clicked create pull request. And the reason that we got this Codecov stuff ahead of time, like once I clicked that button, was because push had already ran. So tests had already run, code coverage reports had already been uploaded to Codecov, and we can actually take a look at that if that's kind of confusing to people right now. So Codecov had already replied with that notification, and there's the comment that I mentioned.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, talking helped give me enough time for it to actually happen and load. Okay, so let's take a look at the comment first because it's right in front of my screen and it'll load it up. So I mentioned, hey, like, we were at 97.22% before, and we removed the comment so that the test would run, and now this pull request is at 100%. It also tells you, like, hey, like, you're hitting 2 more lines of code, which is great. The 2 lines of code are the divided by 0 and also the actual test case, and that you've decreased the number of misses because you are now covering that return from the divide function. We also have like what files are actually impacted. And so these are the two files. Again, we had the calculator that's impacted because now we should be covering that, and we'll take a look at the report in a second. And we also changed the test underscore calculator.py file, adding in that new test. So that all looks great. But I did mention these two status checks. Oh, that was 4. I think it might have duplicated in the cycle because of the difference in the push and the pull request. But that typically doesn't happen. But in any case, the patch, as we mentioned, should be 100% because all of the new code that you test are actually running. But the more important one is this project check. As I mentioned, we didn't have 100% coverage. We now have 100% coverage over the entire project. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. It's really cool to see all that directly there within that same context.
Yeah, I feel like as a developer, like we don't like being outside our context, and the closer you can kind of get to where you are working, the better it is for everyone. Like context switching is so costly as a developer, any field for that matter, but it's so expensive to have to switch back and forth between things that if we can get it to you as close to you as possible, it's at least more useful to you.
Yeah.
So I mentioned the Codecov report. Let's take a look at that. We did just change some of our URLs. So, oh, hey, it redirects perfectly.
Nice. There you go.
Phew. Live.
That was a close one.
It was a close one. But so this is what the polls tab in the Codecov UI looks like. And so I basically just clicked on Codecov or the PR number in the Codecov comment. Sorry, a lot of C words there. And this is kind of a general overview of what it looks like when you are adding or changing coverage, right? And so, as I mentioned, we uncommented this test case, and now it's covered. But also, more importantly, this particular line cannot divide by 0 is covered. What we can do for fun, I haven't done this, so let's do it for fun. Let's remove test cases.
Uh-oh. That sounds like a bad idea.
Well, let's be bad and let's see what it actually looks like, right? Because, this is all good and like it was already here. But let's say we don't care about divide anymore.
I never divide anything anyway.
Yeah, who does division? It's just multiplication. Okay, so I'm adding this in Git. I'm going to commit it. Let's see, fix. Divide is deprecated. Not testing it anymore. And I'm going to push this up. And let's go back. And oh, shoot, we're on a different branch. We're on add test 0. Okay. Let me go back to add tests. And I'm going to make the same command and same change.
Okay.
I think it'll just be a little more consistent because we're already here. Okay. So, like I mentioned, we're moving divide, git commit, and let's push. So we see that it's pushed up here. I'm going to refresh the page.
No, there's that yellow bubble again.
Yeah, yellow bubbles. And we can actually, let's just watch one for fun. It's cute. I didn't talk about what our CI is actually doing. And if it lets me close it, there we go. We can talk about it before we show Codecov stuff. Because if you aren't familiar with CI/CD, this is a kind of great little introduction. So I mentioned earlier that CI/CD kind of runs these sort of steps before you actually push to production. In this particular case, we're setting up Python. We're installing dependencies. I think our dependencies are really only like, well, actually, there's a lot. PyTest. PyTest is a test runner for Python, and PyTest also collects coverage. As a result of coverage. So we're installing these dependencies, we're running our tests, and we're collecting coverage. And like I mentioned, like most languages already have some sort of code coverage thing. And a lot of them will output information like this. So like for us, this is really useful. So I could take a look at this right now and say, oh, great, like I already know my code coverage is decreasing. And I know that because, hey, I'm not covering the divide function anymore. But like I said, codecov is really useful because this is great and it kind of exists statically. But if you're in a pull request and you're looking at it as a reviewer, you don't want to be clicking around for things. So codecov kind of lives in that PR so that it's easily accessible to the reviewer as well as the developer. The next step, we're uploading code coverage to codecov. If you're using GitHub Actions, there is a codecov action. If you're not familiar with GitHub Actions, or you're not familiar with like the words I'm sort of talking about, an action is very specific to GitHub Actions. There are other ways of uploading coverage to codecov, and we have steps on our documentation and website to do that. But if you are using GitHub Actions, this is kind of like the easiest way to do it. But as you see here, we have a nice little ASCII codecov logo. And then we're just processing this file and we're pushing it up to codecov. And then some post steps. Okay, so that was just this is what is actually happening when you are running CI/CD.
Okay.
So I'm going to go back to the actual PR and take a look at what's sort of happening here. So at this point, the commit has updated, and this will update every time you push a commit and CI finishes its run. We already know, though, that I should be decreasing coverage because, again, not testing Divide anymore. And we see that here. It's like, oh, great. Like now it's 90.32. But we also see these status checks here. And I mentioned that because GitHub systems can say, great, like if a status check fails, don't allow a pull request to be merged. And so if you are more sophisticated or you have different organizational standards for what your testing should be like, this is a great place to make those sort of requirements. But we know, again, code coverage is decreasing. And we can take a look at the PR too, just to double check I'm not lying. And we see that here.
Nice. Okay.
Look at that. We're not covering it anymore.
Yeah. Get out of here.
So that was the codecov demo.
Excellent. Where is it? Do you hear that? Potentially? Is it coming through?
Hearing what?
No? I have a crowd cheering playing.
Oh, you do? Oh, no.
Yeah, what? I don't hear it, though. All right. I'll have to troubleshoot that.
Oof.
I should have tests for this. Anyway, there was a crowd cheering. That was great. Appreciate you doing that on the spot like that. Yeah, well done. Well done. So to close things out, one more question that I kind of had to come to mind as well is from Log. They were talking about unit test coverage versus test coverage as a whole, which includes things like security testing, end-to-end testing, accessibility testing.
Yep.
So I guess the question, I'm going to summarize a little bit, maybe rephrase the question from not even a question, it was just a statement, but turn it into a question from Log. And that is, we've been seeing unit tests and being able to use those and report them to code coverage to give us that nice reporting and visibility into everything, right?
Yep.
Can it also accept things like results for end-to-end testing or other test type of tools that can report into that?
So the answer is complicated, and it's complicated because end-to-end test, the answer is yes, typically. Accessibility, not always, because I don't know if accessibility is necessarily like a line-by-line thing. So, for example, you might be, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not actually too familiar with accessibility coverage, but what I believe it to be are things like checking to make sure things are colorblind friendly. And I don't think that works very well on a line-by-line code-based system. I mentioned this earlier. Sorry, I'm going to get really excited because I love talking about this. It's one of my favorite things to talk about.
Okay.
With code coverage, at least. And Lognor brought up, hey, what about end-to-end testing? So we were working with, I don't know if I can say a company, so I'm going to say a unknown large gaming company.
Okay.
And they were dealing with a particular scenario. And the scenario was this. They were saying, hey, we want to know if me, game tester at said game company, is playing the game, I want to know what I'm actually hitting. I want to know what lines of code I'm hitting and what lines of code I'm not hitting. Because I want to know what edge cases are exist, or what code isn't actually being used or whatnot. And so we were talking with them for a while, and what we inevitably came up with is hey, if you can spit out a generalized format of like what coverage, sorry, like of a coverage report in your end-to-end test or like in your gameplay test, like we will ingest it just fine. Like there's no problem there.
Yeah.
And so what was really exciting is they were able to like have manual testers play the game and immediately tell them back, hey, like this is what you were testing and this is what you haven't actually tested
Wow.
in your gameplay.
Yeah, yeah.
So like I wasn't a really big gamer, but I played a lot of StarCraft, and I'm just imagining if you're not familiar with StarCraft, it's a pretty old game now. But it's like a real-time strategy game, and you play an alien race, and you're trying to win, trying to take over everything. But I'm just imagining someone like playing StarCraft and being like, "Oh no, like I haven't mined these minerals or something."
Yeah, yeah. Using codecov and
Using
test coverage to let them know that
Yeah.
they missed this part of the game.
So that's like one part of it. But we recently, not recently, I think maybe a year ago, we did a talk with oh my gosh, Cypress. Cypress, they do end-to-end testing JavaScript. I think dominantly JavaScript. And so we did talk with them on how they use Codecov with their end-to-end integration, end-to-end tests, and how that's helpful for them. I think like kind of like the final note on all of this, I mentioned it earlier, but I think it's like also important to stress is that I'm not here to say you should 100% cover your test. In fact, I have a blog post which is published
Oh, yes?
um, about why you shouldn't cover all of your tests.
Ooh, what?
Why you shouldn't aim for 100% coverage. And I'll put
Case against 100% code coverage. I
that
think I
is
got
it.
it.
That's the one.
I got you. I'm gonna drop it in the chat too.
Because I feel like a lot of the pushback I get from people on code coverage is like, oh, but like I don't want to get 100%. It's like impossible to get 100%. And I agree. Sometimes it's not worth getting 100%. But what you should care about are the parts of your code base that are important. So like if I have a billing page, I'm going to care about like the checkout flow a lot more than I'm going to care about like the settings page. Where like, yeah, settings page is important, of course, or like user avatars are important, but they're really not more business important than being able to pay for a thing. Or seeing your customers being able to buy a product or to like get the data that they need to be successful. And so I think while it is important that you write unit tests, and I think Logno was talking about this earlier, where it's like, hey, like aren't unit tests dead? I don't think they're dead. I think they're very much like still alive. But I think the importance of end-to-end tests has increased.
Hmm.
I think end-to-end tests are definitely where a lot of organizations are leaning into because they care about, as you mentioned before, Brian, the behaviors of a user, as opposed to my function adds two numbers together.
Right.
And so, yeah, I understand that it's not always possible to 100% unit test your coverage, but you should be testing the important parts of your code base.
Yeah. No, I love the way you put that, and I think it's a great way to close things out. What do you say?
Sounds great.
There any where can folks find you? I see it's Tom who.
Yeah, it's on Who on most of my socials except Twitter.
Except Twitter.
Someone else took it.
Oh.
But you can find me on Twitter at Thomas, so THOMAS, rock like a stone, who spelled the same way on the screen.
Gotcha. Awesome.
Not so fast.
Cool. And I shared some links to some of the Codecov stuff that you mentioned. They'll also be in the description of the recording of this for folks to check out later.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom, so much. This was really insightful. I had a lot of fun, learned a lot. And I hope we gotta stay in touch. We gotta do more of
Absolutely.
this.
Yeah. Come up. I'm in New York. Come up to New York anytime. Come visit. We'll have a blast.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Don't go anywhere just
really
yet.
good food.
What's that?
We'll eat great food.
Yes, I know it. I absolutely know it. Thank you so much for that. All right, don't go anywhere just yet, Tom. I'm gonna close things out and then we'll say bye. All right. Thanks everybody for watching. We really appreciate you being here, whether you're watching on Twitch or on YouTube. Be sure to make sure you follow on Twitch if you haven't done so already and you like this content and you want to see some more. And if you're on YouTube, like the video. If it helped you out, I'm sure it did. Don't you forget to do that and subscribe for more. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you next time right here on Sneak Live. Bye. Peace out. Somebody roll the end credits. Ah!